Florida has always counted on one thing: Canadians. Every winter, millions of them trade snow for sunshine, filling Miami's hotels, Orlando's theme parks, and coastal condos from Naples to Fort Lauderdale. They don't just visit, they fuel Florida's economy. Billions in tourism dollars arrive like clockwork, season after season, as predictable as the tide. But then, without warning, it all stopped. The beaches looked the same, but the loungers sat empty. The resorts kept their pools sparkling, but the rooms went unbooked. Flights to Miami that once ran full were suddenly half empty. In Orlando, hotels near Disney saw their best customers simply vanish. For a state that depends on Canadians more than any other group of international visitors, it was like the lifeblood of the economy had quietly drained away. And here's the shocking part. This collapse wasn't triggered by a hurricane. It wasn't the aftermath of a recession. It wasn't even a pandemic. This was something far quieter, far more unsettling. This was Canada's silent rebellion. No protests, no headlines, just millions of Canadians who, without raising their voices or waving a single flag, chose to close their wallets. And Florida, more than anywhere else in America, felt the shock first. Because when your best customer disappears overnight, the ripple doesn't just hit hotels and beaches, it shakes the foundation of the entire state economy. And yet this was only the beginning. So what exactly was this silent weapon? And how did Canadians manage to devastate Florida without ever saying a word? Florida normally welcomes over 4 million Canadian visitors annually. By far its biggest group of international tourists. They're not just vacationers, they're the retirees who rent winter homes in Naples, the families who book week-long Disney packages in Orlando, the couples who escape to Miami's beaches every February. Together they spend billions of dollars every single year, but then it stopped. The condos sat empty, the restaurants once buzzing with Canadian snowbirds served half as many tables. In some towns, rental agencies saw cancellations spike so fast they thought their systems were broken. Within weeks, billions of dollars had quietly evaporated from Florida's economy. And the most unnerving part? There was no visible trigger, no natural disaster to blame, no policy change announced. On the surface, nothing looked different, but the money was gone, and with it, Florida's sense of stability. This wasn't a dip in bookings. It was something more deliberate, a cold shoulder from America's quietest neighbor. And Florida, the state that had long relied on Canadians as its safety net, was left exposed. But the real shock came not just from the empty beaches and hotels. It came from the raw panic inside Florida's tourism industry as they realized their most reliable guests weren't coming back. And that's where the story truly begins. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. In Miami, luxury resorts that once thrived on Canadian high spenders began losing their winter lifeline. The penthouse suites, usually booked months in advance, now sat empty. Restaurants along Ocean Drive cut hours as their most reliable guests disappeared. Even the nightlife scene felt quieter. The steady flow of Canadians who had quietly fueled the city's winter economy simply stopped showing up. In Orlando, the impact was just as brutal. Families who had filled the gates of Disney and Universal year after year weren't coming. Hotel bookings collapsed, leaving entire floors unoccupied. Restaurants and souvenir shops around the parks reported losses they hadn't seen since the worst days of the pandemic. For a city built on constant motion and crowds, the silence was deafening. And then came the snowbird towns, Naples, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach. For decades, Canadians had treated these places like a second home. Winter rentals were usually locked in a year in advance. Condos and apartments passed down through families as cherished traditions. But suddenly, the contracts weren't renewed. Landlords stared at rows of empty units. Local diners, golf courses, and small businesses saw their best customers vanish overnight. One hotel manager summed it up with chilling honesty. "We survived hurricanes. We survived recessions. But losing Canadians? That's worse. Because unlike storms or downturns, this wasn't something Florida could rebuild from. It wasn't a one-time hit. It was a shift in loyalty. And once that loyalty was gone, it was nearly impossible to win back. Which raises the real question: why? What made millions of Canadians turn away from Florida, not with anger or outrage, but with quiet, devastating resolve? To understand why Canadians turned their backs on Florida, you have to look beyond the beaches and theme parks. This wasn't about sunburns or flight prices. It was about respect, or rather, decades of feeling disrespected. For years, Washington treated Canada less like a partner and more like an afterthought. Trade disputes turned into trade wars, with sudden tariffs slapped on Canadian steel and aluminum as if they were rivals, not allies. Politicians in D.C. joked about Canada as America's 51st state, a place expected to follow orders quietly without complaint. The humor didn't land in Ottawa. It stung. And then there was the military betrayal Canadians never forgot. In the 1950s, Canada developed the Avro Arrow, a fighter jet years ahead of its time, faster, stronger, a symbol of national pride. But under pressure from Washington, the program was scrapped, the prototypes destroyed, and thousands of engineers scattered. Canada's dream of aerospace independence was gutted, while American contractors cashed in. Decades later, the story repeated with the F-35. America pushed Canada to buy into the most expensive weapons program in history, despite endless flaws: aircraft that overheated in the Arctic, engines that failed basic tests. To many Canadians, it wasn't a deal, it was coercion, and it reinforced the old wound. When U.S. interests clash with Canadian pride, Canada is expected to fold. But this time something changed. Canadians didn't storm the streets or shout on social media. They did something quieter, more powerful. They remembered. And when the time came, they decided to push back, not with protests, but with silence. And Florida, more than anywhere else, felt the cost. Because when Canada finally decided to flex its quiet economic muscle, it wasn't Washington that bled first. It was Florida's hotels, Florida's beaches, Florida's billion-dollar tourism industry. But here's the twist. The money didn't vanish. Canadians didn't stop traveling. They just stopped traveling to America. And where that money went next tells an even bigger story. Here's the thing. Canadians didn't stop traveling. They didn't suddenly decide to sit at home all winter. The planes kept flying, the suitcases kept rolling. They just weren't heading to Florida anymore. Instead, those dollars started showing up somewhere else. The beaches of Mexico saw a surge of Canadian visitors, especially in Cancun and Puerto Vallarta, where all-inclusive resorts welcomed them with open arms. In the Caribbean, places like the Dominican Republic and Jamaica saw record bookings, fueled by Canadians who once would have been sipping cocktails on Miami Beach. Even European cruises and Mediterranean getaways saw an unexpected boost as Canadians traded Florida condos for adventures abroad. The shift was unmistakable. Florida's hotels and theme parks were bleeding, while Mexico and the Caribbean cashed in. Billions of Canadian dollars that once flowed straight into Florida's economy were now boosting competitors around the world. Or, as one analyst put it, Florida's loss became Mexico's gain. And that's what made this so devastating. It wasn't just a temporary dip. It was a redirection of loyalty, a conscious choice to spend money elsewhere. Once those dollars found new homes, there was little reason to bring them back. And Florida's collapse was only the start. Because as the world watched Canada quietly pull this off, other U.S. allies began asking themselves a dangerous question. If Canada can walk away, why can't we? Florida was the epicenter, but the shockwaves didn't stop there. Border towns in New York and Michigan, once bustling with Canadian day trippers, saw their weekend traffic cut in half. Las Vegas, already hurting, watched its Canadian high rollers disappear. Even airlines began cutting U.S. routes, not because of fuel prices, but because the passengers were gone. But Florida remained ground zero, the clearest symbol of how devastating Canada's quiet rebellion could be. billions lost, businesses reeling, an entire state economy shaken without a single protest sign or political declaration. And while Washington tried to brush it off as a temporary dip, the rest of the world was paying attention. In Mexico, leaders wondered what would happen if they, too, redirected tourism and trade away from the US. In the European Union, frustration over being pressured into defense deals sparked quiet conversations. If Canada could say no to Washington, why couldn't they? Even in Asia, allies like Japan and South Korea, long seen as unshakable US partners, began asking tough questions about whether depending so heavily on America was really in their best interest. What Canada proved was simple but revolutionary. You don't need a massive army or a loud protest to challenge a superpower. All it takes is economic leverage and the courage to use it. And that realization leads to something even bigger. Because Florida's collapse wasn't just about tourism, it was about power. And the balance of that power is starting to shift in ways America never expected. For decades, America assumed Canada would always be there, quietly fueling its economy, filling its hotels, and propping up its industries without complaint. Florida, more than anywhere else, embodied that unspoken deal. Canadians show up, Americans collect the dollars. Simple, reliable, guaranteed. But now that guarantee is gone. Florida's collapse wasn't just about empty beaches or abandoned condos. It was a symbol, proof that even the world's most polite neighbor could shake a superpower without firing a shot. Canada no longer automatically fuels the U.S. economy. It chooses where its dollars go, and this time they didn't go south. For Washington, that's the most dangerous lesson of all, because if Florida, America's crown jewel of tourism, can be brought to its knees by a silent boycott, what happens when the rest of the world decides to do the same? And that question isn't just theory, because as we speak, Mexico, Europe, and Asia are already exploring ways to follow Canada's lead. Canada's quiet rebellion didn't just drain Florida's economy, it rewrote the rules of power. No armies, no speeches, just a closed wallet. And now the world is watching. Because if the Sunshine State can be shaken this easily, imagine what happens when Mexico, Europe, or Asia decide to follow. This is only the beginning. Hit subscribe, because the next chapter in this global shift is already unfolding, and you won't want to miss it.